Hello YouTube, this is Wakia Lion coming to you pre-record from his camper. Out of the 7 sins that I could come up with, Sloth, I believe, is the most appropriate for the Dirgic Lord. It was difficult for me to see how Sloth really functions. We all know the concept of lazy, but lazy is something that we throw at someone who isn't doing what we think or feel they should be doing. It's not a true descriptor at all of what the person actually is. Looking at the balances to Saturn, the moon and the sun, a person's envy and vanity, pride put together, it became clearer to me. Taking those concepts and applying it to people in real life, it was easier for me to understand, I believe, where they were coming from and why they were doing what they were doing, mostly. As with looking at the sun and the moon, I also looked at Venus and Mercury, for they also are associated with the elements earth and air, as well as the signs and the houses that Saturn rules over, Capricorn in the 10th and Aquarius in the 11th. In my conceptualization of New Age Chaldeanism, I also broke the planets into 3 categories, based off of Sigmund Freud's id, ego, and superego. Saturn, as is appropriate, is the first lord that maintains the border between the id and the ego from the superego lords. Superego, in this case, represents the collective people as well as our higher ideals that the superego is associated with. This understanding gave both a clearer picture of sloth as well as duty. To put it simply, sloth is what happens when someone's lack of ego becomes depression. Whereas duty is what happens when somebody's lack of ego becomes manic. And it overextends itself. This is an oddity, I know. We generally associate laziness with someone who is too egotistical, not wanting to get their hands dirty, feeling that it is beneath them, or that they just want to laze about because they're comfortable. Here's the thing. Ego has a direction, a drive, a desire for advancement and purpose. It is the will to thrive. It is inherently not lazy. How could it be? It's the sun and the moon, the 2 most influential and active lords in our lives outside of the earth itself. The sun is a raging fireball that fills the solar system with its life-giving light. The moon constantly governs our sense of time and biological mechanisms. Lords know how many other things the moon directly affects. When someone is lazy, they have a complete lack of will, a complete lack of true desire and, frankly, joy in their lives. They are self-centered, but in a different way, a distant way, as if they aren't really here, aren't really a part of life, almost like they're in an anesthetic coma of sorts. This state of unfeeling, I believe, is what true sloth is. It's a true state of undeath. From my observations, people who are in a state of sloth are, in a way, in a form of functioning depression, like they don't have a point to their existence. The person who is too egotistical to do work they consider beneath them. My question is, why? The job needs to get done. It benefits you to do it. It helps you in every conceivable way possible because you flex while doing it. You show what you will do, what must be done to make life happen. It inspires people. Why not do it? As I'm sure most of you have probably learned at this point, narcissism isn't the overabundance of ego, it's the lacking of. Narcissistic people are fragile by their nature, having to puff themselves up to protect their fragility. It's much the same thing with slothful people. They would rather appear as what we understand as lazy rather than for people to know the truth that they are pointless. That being said, coming closer to the border of inversion, the slothful side of the spectrum is someone who is a bit more relatable. The worker who only does what they are told to do, doesn't do an inch more unless they're given incentive, and generally just exists in the everyday grind. When crossing the border, I think this can best be explained by burnout. Anyone who doesn't know, burnout is this state where someone just works. That's it, they just work. They become robotic, unfeeling, uninspired, emotionally drained, almost too cognizant of their surroundings, too plugged into to ever disconnect. It's like a state of purposeful purposelessness. Again, it's like a state of purposeful purposelessness. Duty is the other side of the spectrum. It's what happens when someone goes beyond basic principle to the point of extreme productivity. I'm sure we've all met someone or know someone directly who this can be applied to. A workaholic who is almost in a constant state of survival mode, whose only drive in life is to fulfill a goal that they compulsively view as their entire point for existing. Self-destructive is an understatement for people who are like this. It's almost like they are in a state of hyper living. They are uncomfortable with sitting still, with not being productive and active. It's basically a state of mania. If they don't fulfill this constant drive for completion and productivity, they crash into a state of depression or hypermania, i.e., mental breakdown. They constantly feel the need to feed their ego, which is where this comes from. This is the opposite of sloth, where sloth feels pointless and defeatist. Duty is extreme activity. But this all stems from the same place, a general sense of absence that both sides of the spectrum are trying to fulfill. The best way for me to describe this functioning is to give an old title that Saturn used to be called by, Sol Niger, the Black Sun. The exact opposite of what the normal sun that we know represents. With duty on the less extreme end, this becomes more akin to a general workaholic or an overachiever. Someone who will go beyond the call of duty, but not to the point where it doesn't make logical sense. It is someone who I think is more community oriented, who is more driven by a purpose rather than an impulsiveness. This type of person could probably be best described as a parent who is always gone for work but always comes home with makeup gifts for their absence. Someone who is emotionally and maybe mentally distant, but who at least tries to be there physically. Going across the line of inversion into the realm of sloth, this is probably what a mental crash would look like. It is a complete catatonic depression, completely lacking the ability to even lift their arms off the bed, and again, becoming so distant that they don't even exist in their own bodies. I think that when it comes to the two sides of the spectrum, Saturn's ultimate difficulty is figuring out how to wrestle with its inherently negative nature. Being a black sun, it would make sense that it is everything that the sun and the moon are not. That is, not about the self, but about others. It's logic oriented, it's community oriented, its purpose in existence is to be of service to something beyond itself. The beyond that it knows exists because it looks at it directly, completely unshielded by Jupiter or the Sun. It stands as the border of the void, looking beyond as the greatest planet of the outer lords. It's in this place where it sees what lies in both the void and the inner worlds, this sense of constant dread, mixed with an unending need or burden to shield the inner worlds from the darkness beyond. It's understandable how Saturn can be associated with the unsung heroes of our world. Working class soldiers, exhausted or distant parents, fearful talents, always afraid of being a phony or being rejected, the never born heroes of society. This, at the worst point of this, is when those people who were too afraid to stand or who broke themselves against the walls of time, the worst state that they can become is that of the villain, right? That old saying, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. That is Saturn, just as it was the case in his Greek myth. He becoming such for fear of being replaced, for fear of change. As the saying goes, though, the world is darkest before the dawn. At the breaking of that dawn, at the precipice of the borders between, I think it appropriate to say that it is where true heroes are born. Those who stand the test of time, who do what must be done, regardless of the fears associated with it, regardless of the rationales for or against it. That is Saturn. That is the point of sloth and duty. To stand when one can, and to sit when one must. The word for it, prudence. And that, I think, Saturn finds its purpose. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it a great deal, and I look forward to lecturing you again in the next video. Bye.